Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 7th, 2020. Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 7th, 2020. Khamenei wants to put Iran's stamp on reprisal for U.S. killing of top general. In the tense hours following the American killing of a top Iranian military commander, the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, made a rare appearance at a meeting of the government's National Security Council to lay down the parameters for any retaliation. Over the weekend, the president had repeatedly threatened to retaliate for any attacks against American interests by ordering airstrikes against as many as 52 potential targets, one for each American hostage held after the seizure of the United States Embassy in Tehran in 1979. As Iranian leaders weighed just what form it might take, analysts said the targets included American troops in neighboring Syria and Iraq, American bases in the Persian Gulf, or American embassies or diplomats almost anywhere. Bolton is willing to testify in Trump impeachment trial, raising pressure for witnesses. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida wrote on Twitter that the Senate should only consider the same testimony and evidence the House relied upon when they pass articles of impeachment. Our job is to vote on what the House passed, not to conduct an open-ended inquiry, he tweeted. Senator Josh Hawley, Republican of Missouri, went further, introducing a long-shot resolution to allow the Senate to dismiss the articles of impeachment if the House failed to deliver them within 25 calendar days. If Speaker Pelosi is afraid to try her case, Mr. Hawley said, the articles should be dismissed for failure to prosecute, and Congress should get back to doing the people's business. If he did appear under oath on Capitol Hill, Mr. Bolton would be the closest advisor to the president to answer questions about what Mr. Trump said behind closed doors as he pressured the Ukrainians to investigate his political rivals, as he was withholding nearly $400 million in military aid from the country. Pentagon rules out striking Iranian cultural sites, contradicting Trump. Defense Secretary Mark T. Esper sought to douse an international outcry on Monday by ruling out military attacks on cultural sites in Iran if the conflict with Tehran escalates further, despite President Trump's threat to destroy some of the country's treasured icons. Rather than simply say that cultural sites were not actually being targeted, the official said he decided to double down on. Rather than simply say the cultural sites were not actually being targeted, the official said, he decided to double down on the next day with reporters flying him He decided to double down the next day with reporters flying with him on Air Force One, scoffing at the idea that Iran could kill our people while we're not allowed to touch their cultural site, saying it doesn't work that way. The comments drew protests from Iran and other American adversaries who say they show that Mr. Trump is the aggressor, and not just against Iran's government, but against its people, its history, its very nationhood. Destroying some of these culturally significant Iranian sites wouldn't be seen just as an attack against the regime of Tehran. It could be construed as an attack on history and humanity. Iran, home to one of the world's most storied ancient civilizations, has 22 cultural sites designated on the World Heritage List by UNESCO, the United Nations Cultural Organization, including the ruins of Persepolis, the capital of the Achaemenid Empire, later conquered by Alexander the Great. Harvey Weinstein charged with rape in Los Angeles as NY trial starts. Though the authorities in Los Angeles could issue a warrant for Mr. Weinstein's arrest, it was highly unlikely they would disrupt the trial in New York by seeking his removal to California, or that the judge in New York would allow it. Mr. Weinstein's lawyers had hoped to call the detective Nicholas Guaido as a part of an effort to cast doubt on the New York Police Department's investigation of Mr. Weinstein. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office had also won permission to call 3 other women who have yet to be identified to testify about their allegations of sexual assault by the producer. Democrats, newly dominant in Virginia, raced to make new laws. We have old school Democrats, moderate Democrats who represent moderate areas, and then you have progressives. You're going to see bills that are very aggressive, but the question is whether they make it out of the committee. Democrats may find that control of state government does not always translate into overwhelming legislative success, political analysts said. In New Mexico, also controlled by Democrats, conservative-leaning Democrats and Republicans in the legislature prevented the repeal of a law that would prohibit abortion in the state if Roe v. Wade is struck down by the Supreme Court. The political trifecta in Virginia, Democrat Ralph Northam is the governor, makes it the first southern state where Democrats have become the dominant power since Trump took office. Biden and Sanders differ on foreign policy. They're happy to tell you so. The rising tensions with Iran have also afforded Mr. Sanders a fresh opportunity to highlight his diplomacy-centered vision for foreign policy, and in particular, his opposition to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a stance that underscores his contrast with Mr. Biden, who voted to authorize that war. Mr. Biden, a Catholic, has long-standing relationships in the city, but Mr. Drehozal added that Dubuque also has a very vocal, very active, very progressive community that is very supportive of Senator Sanders. Mr. Sanders views his consistent diplomacy over conflict stance, dating to his opposition to the Vietnam War, and his anti-interventionist foreign policy as mayor of Burlington, Vermont, as an advantage with working-class Americans who are frustrated with the country's involvement in costly and distant wars. Aides to Mr. Sanders view him as well-positioned against Mr. Biden, who in many ways embodies the centrist Washington establishment Mr. Sanders dislikes, and they have urged him for months to go after the vice president more directly. The springs ran dry, then this Australian town burned. Over the weekend, he said the government would deploy 3,000 military reservists along with aircraft and Navy vessels in one of the largest uses of military assets at home since World War II. The bush fires mirror what other places have witnessed in recent years, places like the Brazilian rainforest or the far north of Sweden, where natural fires are rare, are seeing record fires. Across Australia, we're seeing fire into systems that have not seen fire since European contact, said Kingsley Dixon, an ecologist and botanist at Curtin University. Targeting cultural sites in war is illegal. It's also barbaric. The most relevant legal instrument is the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, adopted to prevent the type of plundering of art the Nazis undertook during World War II. The convention states, among other principles, that countries shall refrain from any act directed by way of reprisals against cultural property. Such acts of war would also obviously violate UNESCO World Heritage Convention, which establishes that national treasures also form part of a protected global patrimony. In 2016, the International Criminal Court, to which the United States is still not a part, completed its first successful cultural war crimes prosecution, when a Malian extremist pleaded guilty to having demolished a mosque in the ancient city of Timbuktu. Nor can modern creations such as the Avicenna Mausoleum in Hamadan, dedicated to the greatest scholar of the Islamic Golden Age, be omitted from any list of sites of Iranian cultural significance. What is Trump's Iran strategy? Few seem to know. Why? There's not a single person I've spoken to who can tell you what Trump is up to with Iran, said Eli Geranmaya, an analyst at the European Council for Foreign Relations. Throughout months of proxy conflict, American military responses have ranged from muted to non-existent, as in the case of an attack on Saudi oil facilities that was believed to be the work of Iran, to extreme escalations, like the killing of Mr. Soleimani. Brett McGurk, who until last year was the administration's special envoy to the coalition against the Islamic State, warned his former bosses in an article for Foreign Affairs that their maximalist demands have left no plausible on-ramp for Iran to enter negotiations, since nobody, including the Iranians, know what Iran is supposed to negotiate about. Ms. Kay said Iran might conclude that it should tread with extreme caution. The 52 Iran hostages felt forgotten. Here's what they wish would happen now. President Trump later referred to the hostage crisis in a warning to Iran not to retaliate, saying in a tweet that the United States had pinpointed 52 Iranian sites as potential targets to represent the 52 Americans held by Iran from 1979 to 1981. In interviews, several of the former hostages said they were both surprised to be remembered and also reluctant to be pulled into a fraught and potentially violent political battle. V. Thomas Lankford, a lawyer in Alexandria, Virginia, who represents many of the former Iranian hostages and their families, is still fighting for further payment. Iran and presidential war powers explained. Democratic leaders in Congress are moving to swiftly invoke the war powers resolution in an attempt to block President Trump from taking the United States into a war with Iran, even as Iran vows revenge for his killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani. And Mr. Trump is threatening disproportionate strikes inside Iran if it does retaliate. What is the War Powers Resolution? It is a law Congress enacted in 1973, overriding President Richard M. Nixon's veto, in an attempt to regain control over war decisions that had eroded during the Cold War. Although the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war, the United States military kept a large standing force deployed around the world as World War II gave way to the Cold War. How U.S. troops are preparing for the worst in the Middle East. The influx of new forces was prompted by several events: the death of an American contractor in Iraq during a rocket attack on December 27th, carried out by an Iranian-backed militia, protests around the United States Embassy in Baghdad afterward, following a series of American strikes on the militia, and last week's drone strike on General Soleimani and Mr. al-Muhandis. The Marines, fresh off helping American forces withdraw from northeastern Syria, are reinforcing dozens of security personnel positioned at the American Embassy in Baghdad. The compound is large, more than 100 acres, with guard posts, living areas, dining halls, and small shops. The Rangers, part of the secretive Joint Special Operations Command, most likely will act as a reaction force if any Iranian-backed forces launch a concerted attack on the American position, according to one Defense Department official. Fox hosts America First shift makes an exception for Trump's Iran strike. Immediately after President Trump ordered the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani of Iran, some of the loudest applause was heard from Pete Hegseth, a Fox News host and a decorated veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. He's a terrorist who has killed Americans. We knew where he was, and the president took a bold move to get rid of him. And people around the globe are thankful for that, Mr. Hegseth said on the set of Fox and Friends. A perch he often takes to validate and at times influence Mr. Trump's military policies. Having been successful in the Gallagher case, Mr. Hegzeth has now taken up the cause of winning pardons for the Blackwater security contractors who were found guilty in 2007 shootings of dozens of unarmed Iraqis in Baghdad. Mr. Hegzeth's shift has alienated some longtime allies. For some never-Trumpers, killing of Soleimani was finally something to like. Years before President Trump ordered the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani, Raul Mark Garrett, a former CIA officer and prominent neoconservative commentator, had recommended taking out the notorious Iranian general, either try to capture him or kill him. More than 8 years later, Mr. Garrett got his wish when a drone strike ordered by President Trump killed General Soleimani in Baghdad, touching off an international crisis, even as it delighted a cadre of Republican Middle East hawks, who have been sharply critical of Mr. Trump on many other issues. Days before Mr. Trump's inauguration in January 2017, Michael Rubin, a scholar at the conservative American Enterprise Institute in Washington, who also signed a 2016 letter opposing Mr. Trump on foreign policy grounds, wrote on the Institute's website that General Soleimani should no longer operate with impunity, and that Trump officials should direct significant assets to seek the capture or killing of Soleimani. On Saturday, Mr. Rubin, while expressing concerns about the regional fallout, wrote approvingly that Mr. Trump's action would instill in the minds of American enemies the idea that there is a possibility that they could suffer such consequences. Boris Johnson's balancing act with Trump and Europe on Iran. Mr. Johnson is walking a tightrope that officials said could become even more treacherous if Mr. Trump's showdown with Iran opens a new transatlantic rift. Facing a difficult trade negotiation with Washington, Mr. Johnson can ill afford to alienate Mr. Trump on Iran. One place where Mr. Johnson has stood with the Europeans is in defending the Iran nuclear deal. Republican congressman shares fake image of Obama and Iranian president. As lawmakers in Washington and allies around the world grappled with President Trump's decision to launch a strike that killed Iran's most important general, an Arizona Republican, Representative Paul Gosar, shared a fake image from his personal Twitter account on Monday, purporting to show President Barack Obama shaking hands with President Hassan Rouhani of Iran. What's more, Mr. Rouhani is still the president, contradicting Mr. Gosar's suggestion that he is no longer in power. The Iranian flag in the background of the photoshopped image also appears to be incorrect, as it is missing the white Arabic script on its top green bar and a red emblem of a tulip in the central white bar. No one said it wasn't photoshopped. No one said the president of Iran was dead. No one said Obama met with Rouhani in person. Mr. Gosar tweeted after an outcry over his post, arguing that his point was that Obama coddled, appeased, nurtured, and protected the world's #1 sponsor of terror. The fake image has been circulating online since at least 2013, surfacing on Middle Eastern blogs and conservative websites. Government website is hacked with pro-Iran messages. Hacked by Iran cybersecurity group hackers, text on the website read before it was put back online. In some cases, the Iranian government pays hackers to conduct such attacks, Mr. Holtquist said. In others, the hacks come from people conscripted by Iran for government service. James A. Lewis, a former government official and cybersecurity expert at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, said the program was probably the agency the hackers found first that had weak security. He said the hack was likely not conducted by Iran's more sophisticated team, but instead recalled a low-budget hack of the sort Iran's Patriot hackers are known for, including the cheesy imagery. Bigger agencies have better defenses and are likely to be safe. Mr. Lewis said. U.S. bet Guaido could transform Venezuela. It hasn't happened. On Monday, Mr. Guaido and many of his allies vowed to press on with their campaign to bring down Mr. Maduro, whose leadership has dragged Venezuela, an oil-rich nation, into the 7th year of a devastating economic crisis that has left much of the population without access to sufficient food or medicine. In defiance of Mr. Maduro's forces, opposition legislators gathered in the headquarters of a newspaper and, in an emotional ceremony before a Venezuelan flag, held their own vote, which they said re-elected Mr. Guaido as the head of the assembly. A year of high-stakes maneuvers by Mr. Guaido, like trying to persuade the military to turn against the president and trying to bring in much-needed humanitarian aid across the border, failed to bring down Mr. Maduro, who retains firm control of the military and of the country's resources. John Bass, U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, steps down on cusp of new peace deal. The departure of the ambassador John R. Bass comes as the United States is again trying to negotiate a tentative peace agreement with the Taliban that could withdraw American forces from Afghanistan in exchange for reduced violence. In recent weeks, Taliban officials and American diplomats had neared announcing some form of a ceasefire across Afghanistan, albeit a brief one. In December, the diplomatic talks had again paused after the Taliban carried out a brazen attack on Bagram Airfield, the largest American base in Afghanistan. A new toll in Mexico's drug war, more than 61,000 vanished. More than 61,000 people have been forcibly disappeared in Mexico in recent years, government officials announced on Monday, a drastic increase of an earlier estimate of the toll of the country's endemic drug-related violence and cartel warfare. In Mexico, the number of cases of disappeared people surged more recently amid raging violence as drug cartels battled each other over territory and trafficking routes. The López Obrador government has faced criticism that it lacks an adequate security strategy to deal with the country's rampant violence, underscored by recent cases like the siege of the city of Culiacan by the Sinaloa cartel and the massacre of 9 members of a Mormon sect in northern Mexico last fall. China grapples with mystery pneumonia-like illness. Symptoms of the new illness include high fever, difficulty breathing, and lung lesions, the Wuhan Health Commission said. In Hong Kong, 21 people who had visited Wuhan in recent weeks were hospitalized between December 31st and noon on Monday, according to that city's health department. The Wuhan government confirmed on December 31st that health authorities were treating dozens of cases of pneumonia of unknown cause only after an emergency notice to the city hospitals was shared on social media sites a day earlier, apparently triggering some public panic. Mogadishu bombing took lives of the best and the brightest. The group's relentless onslaught on both civilian and government establishments in Mogadishu has killed lawmakers, civil servants, business people, journalists, and last July, the mayor of Mogadishu, Abdirahman Omar Osman. The Benadir University students who were killed and maimed at the X-Control intersection were heading to the Dr. Shahid campus on the outskirts of the city. We have to say enough is enough. If you kill another student, you kill all of us, said Mr. Ainty, who is now working on a campaign to commemorate the Benadir students. Britain's most prolific rapist is jailed for life. Apart from victims noticing that they had particularly bad hangovers the next morning, Mr. Sanaga committed the rapes without anyone noticing until a June morning in 2017, when an 18-year-old man woke up in the middle of being assaulted. Mr. Sanaga insisted on taking the case to trial and argued in court that the victims were only pretending to be asleep as a part of sexual role play. Each of Sinaga's 4 trials dealt with between 10 and 13 victims. Iranian Americans questioned at the border. My kids shouldn't experience such things. Arriving at the United States border in Washington state early Sunday morning after a skiing trip to Canada, Nega Hekmati and her family were pulled out of line for further questioning by Customs and Border Protection agents. An agency official told members of Congress on Monday that leaders in local offices had been asked to remain vigilant and increase their situational awareness given the evolving threat environment. A half dozen people of Iranian descent who were held for additional questioning in Washington described extensive questioning about their family and background, even though, like Ms. Hekmati, many were American citizens. United States citizens and legal permanent residents do not have to answer questions about their political views or religious views and practices, and cannot be denied entry into the United States for declining to answer these questions, said Hina Shamsi, director of the American Civil Liberties Union National Security Project. Mike Pompeo is said to decide against running for Senate in Kansas. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Monday told Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, that he does not plan to run for Senate in 2020, most likely ending Republicans' hopes of securing a potentially dominant candidate for the open seat in his home state of Kansas, according to 4 people briefed on the meeting. Without Mr. Pompeo in the race, Republicans face an unsettled primary that includes at least one candidate, Chris Kobach, whom party leaders fear could imperil their hold on a crucial open Senate seat. While the state has not elected a Democrat to the Senate since 1932, Mr. McConnell and other top Republican officials are deeply worried that they could lose the seat should Mr. Kobach, the controversial former Kansas Secretary of State, emerge as their nominee. Answering your 2020 questions. New Year, New Newsletter. Our crack researcher, Isabella Gruyan Paz, went through hundreds of your emails and came up with a few questions that seemed to resonate for several readers. What did we learn from the CBS News surveys of Iowa and New Hampshire? Senator Bernie Sanders is surging, Senator Elizabeth Warren is slipping in New Hampshire, and Joe Biden, the former vice president, seems to be gaining ground in Iowa. Here's his report. Senator Cory Booker of New York, Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, sat before a nearly all-female audience on Monday at New York City branch of The Wing, a women's club and co-working space, and was asked a question. Why shouldn't the next president be a woman? Mr. Booker responded by saying that his heart, soul, and spirit fought harder than ever before to elect Hillary Clinton in 2016. Julian Castro endorses Elizabeth Warren for president. Julian Castro, the former House Secretary, whose progressive presidential candidacy did not make significant inroads with Democratic voters, but earned plaudits from the party's left wing, has endorsed Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, offering a possible lift for her candidacy less than 1 month before the Iowa caucuses. In a statement, Mr. Castro cast Ms. Warren as the logical extension of his campaign's social justice-driven message, which seeks to correct inequities through targeted policy proposals. Ms. Warren, he said, will make sure that no matter where you live in America or where your family came from in the world, you have a path to opportunity, too. The endorsement is not a shock to close observers of the Democratic primary race. Mr. Castro and Ms. Warren have made no secret of their shared affection for each other, but it formalizes a partnership that could help Ms. Warren reignite excitement at a critical moment. Earthquake strikes Puerto Rico, toppling a well-known natural resource. The strong earthquake and persistent aftershocks that rattled Puerto Rico on Monday damaged vulnerable homes, destroyed a photogenic rock formation, and terrified residents scarred by recent hurricanes. About the scarred by recent hurricanes about the prospect of another devastating disaster. "Look at my house," Mr. Alicia, 66, who returned to Puerto Rico from Brooklyn 2 years ago, moving into the house he had built over the course of 30 years in preparation for his retirement. Elizabeth Vanacore, a seismologist with the Puerto Rico Seismic Network, said people felt the recent quakes because they were shallow and occurred near land. Mexican asylum seekers could now be deported to Guatemala. The Trump administration will deport some Mexicans seeking asylum at the United States border to Guatemala as part of a deal that had been praised by Department of Homeland Security officials as a way to deter migration from Central America. The deal made migrants such as Hondurans and Salvadorans ineligible for asylum in the United States if they had traveled by land through Guatemala and did not first apply for asylum there, Homeland Security officials said at the time. 2 Homeland Security officials said on Monday that asylum officers were told over the weekend that Mexican migrants were now amenable to being sent to Guatemala under the agreement. Portland woman accused of snatching hijab is charged with hate crimes. Prosecutors said Ms. Campbell snatched the hijab of the woman, a 24-year-old foreign exchange student from Saudi Arabia, while at a transit stop in Portland in November. Ms. Campbell, who did not know the victim, approached her from behind and grabbed the hijab before trying to choke her with it, the district attorney's office said, citing court documents. After the woman pushed Ms. Campbell away, Ms. Campbell forcibly took the hijab, prosecutors said. Police investigating the release of bed bugs at a Walmart. A manager at the store in Washington Township, about 25 miles south of Erie, reported that an employee found a closed pill bottle containing live bugs on Thursday inside the men's changing room, according to Pennsylvania State Police, which is investigating. On Saturday, a Walmart employee found a second closed pill bottle with several dead bugs on the floor of the men's department, near the belts, the police said. Though the discoveries of the bottles have the hallmark of a prank, Trooper Schick said, "I hope that it was not a prank by an employee. It sounds as if 2 separate employees found 2 separate bottles 2 days in a row. No arrests have been made." Mr. McConnell, it's time to hear from John Bolton. The unredacted emails show that the order to withhold the military aid came straight from Mr. Trump. Clear direction from POTUS to hold, wrote Michael Duffy, a top budget official, even as Pentagon officials repeatedly questioned the legality of the hold and pushed for the aid's release. If the president was fighting corruption, why was he being secretive about it? By the late spring of 2019, the Trump administration had already approved aid packages to Ukraine almost 50 times, not once holding the help up over concerns about corruption. If Mr. Trump has nothing to hide, if his own decision to withhold Ukraine aid was based on a similar concern for national interest and not made for personal gain, then he should be demanding that every administration official involved in the Ukraine machinations, starting with Mr. Bolton, testify under oath in a Senate trial. The nightmare stage of Trump's rule is here. Trump has been threatening to commit war crimes by destroying Iran's cultural sites and tried to use Twitter to notify Congress of his intention to respond to any Iranian reprisals with military escalation. According to Peter Bergen's book, Trump and His Generals, James Mattis, Trump's former Secretary of Defense, instructed his subordinates not to provide the president with options for a military showdown with Iran. Even if Iran were to somehow decide not to strike back at the United States, it's still ramping up its nuclear program, and Trump has obliterated the possibility of a return to negotiations. Trump, the intimidator, fails again. Why does Trump's international strategy, which might be described as winning through intimidation keep failing? And why does he keep pursuing it anyway? One answer, I suspect, is that, like all too many Americans, Trump has a hard time grasping the fact that other countries are real. That is, that we're not the only country whose citizens would rather pay a heavy price in money and even in blood than make what they see as a humiliating concession. Here's where Trump's second error comes in. He has never shown any sign of understanding why America used to be special. Trump has turned his back on everything that used to make America great. Harvey Weinstein is monster of the moment, but the whole system is rigged. Over 80 women have made public accusations against Mr. Weinstein on Monday. He was charged in Los Angeles with 4 counts of sexual assault. How will such an institution fairly referee the choices women are routinely faced with? For instance, navigating Hollywood offices and hotel rooms in a system stacked toward sexual exploitation, where women's looks and sexual allure have historically been the entrance ticket for career advancement, and where extracting sexual kowtowing from women has been, for certain serial abusers, a measure of their power in the industry. It's exciting to see that momentum start to transform the screen images that shape the larger culture too. Women playing down the come hither thing, more offbeat looking women, a few chunky women. Killing Qasem Soleimani was illegal and predictable. Much of the discussion in the aftermath of the killing of Major General Qasem Soleimani last week has focused on the legality of the attack, whether or not his death was carried out by assassination or targeted killing. Administration officials have chosen the latter, following the War on Terror playbook. His administration's lawyers reason that despite the ban on assassinations, targeted killings against non-state actors outside the zone of active hostilities and in cases of imminent threat were lawful as acts of self-defense in the context of the War on Terror, thus authorizing a program that resulted in hundreds of strikes, causing the deaths of thousands of suspected terrorists and an untold number of civilians. In employing the euphemism targeted killing for a member of a sovereign state, the Trump administration has exposed the faulty assumptions and dangerous legacy posed by the War on Terror's targeted killing policy. The steps that led to the killing of Soleimani all accurately define Donald Trump and his leadership since he became president. President Trump's mistake was publicly taking ownership of the action, a behavior that contrasts sharply with what Israel does. The blood of every American or innocent person who will be killed in retaliatory attacks by Iran as a result of President Trump's order to assassinate Qasem Soleimani against the advice of most who are charged with advising him on matters of war is on Mr. Trump's hands. A threat to Iran's rich cultural heritage. The American military has a proud history of avoiding intentional damage to and destruction of cultural sites, which began with President Abraham Lincoln's Law of War Manual, known as the Lieber Code. Protected cultural sites include religious and historic structures, cemeteries, libraries, archives, museums, and archaeological sites. Now, the president is threatening to target cultural sites in Iran, whose rich cultural heritage spans from the earliest evidence of human domestication of plants and animals to ancient, majestic Achaemenid cities and richly tiled Islamic shrines and mosques. Charged with prostitution, she went to a special court. Did it help? Others say the courts have opened the minds of law enforcement officials to the idea of decriminalizing prostitution, while serving as an entry point for people who might otherwise get no services at all. The study found that when social services are mandated by courts, people in prostitution see them as an extension of law enforcement, which they have often been introduced through frightening arrests. A lot of people in sessions stay quiet because they are afraid what they will have an impact. They are afraid what they say will have an impact on the immigration status or what happens to them in court, said Jennifer Orellana, 47, a self-described sex worker from Puerto Rico and member of the advocacy network Make the Road. The counseling would be more helpful for moving people out of prostitution if it offered practical skills such as resume writing or cosmetology classes, she added. Can Penn Station handle 175,000 more riders? Cuomo thinks so. The new tracks would allow the remodeled Penn Station complex to accommodate an additional 175,000 riders to the 650,000 daily travelers who flow through the station now, Mr. Cuomo said during a speech to a business group. The station, tucked below Madison Square Garden in Manhattan, is a nexus for New York City's transportation network. Amtrak, the Long Island Railroad, the subways, and New Jersey Transit all use the station, which serves more passengers daily than the region's three main airports, Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark Liberty International. The proposal to construct additional tracks is one piece of Mr. Cuomo's plan to overhaul the station, which also includes converting a neighboring post office into a new train hub and eventually redesigning the existing train station. In retirement, they help immigrants find their way in New York. The Gendis partnered with Workforce One, a city-run career service, last year to provide church members with job training. Mr. Gendi retired as a hospital controller in August 2016. Ms. Gendi retired as a lab supervisor 2 months later. Mr. Gendi serves as a deacon, and he and Ms. Gendi lead a program that teaches young people about respect, church etiquette, and volunteerism. Driver in distress. It's Cuomo to the rescue again. Who needs AAA when Governor Andrew M. Cuomo is on the road? Mr. Cuomo has a well-documented penchant for aiding motorists in distress. He has pushed cars out of snowdrifts, comforted accident victims, and even hooked a stranded vehicle onto a tow cable, as partially captured by a video recording that was posted online by the governor's staff. Mr. Cuomo climbed into the concrete barrier and, after extricating the van's driver from a seatbelt with a device used by troopers for that purpose, helped the man down from the damaged vehicle. In 2017, Mr. Cuomo's office posted several photos on Twitter of him in a security detail helping a driver who had been stranded amid snow and slush on the Sprain Brook Parkway in Westchester County. Kennedy family member joins NJ race against Democratic defector Jeff Van Drew. The field of Democrats vying to oust Representative Jeff Van Drew got more crowded on Monday as Amy Kennedy, the wife of former Representative Patrick Kennedy, entered the race, bringing the instant name recognition of a political dynasty to the New Jersey congressional race. Representative Joe Kennedy III, the grandson of the former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, is running for the Senate from Massachusetts. Professor Harrison's support from established Democratic Party leaders in the area will presumably help her fundraising efforts, he said, and the Kennedy family's network of donors is expected to work to Miss Kennedy's advantage. Awash in disinformation before vote, Taiwan points finger at China. Fears of Chinese meddling became acute in recent months after a man named Wang Liqiang sought asylum in Australia, claiming he had worked for Chinese intelligence to fund pro-Beijing candidates in Taiwan, buy off media groups, and conduct social media attacks. There are new innovations happening literally every day. In Taiwan, Chinese internet trolls were once easily spotted because they posted using the simplified Chinese characters found only on the mainland. In December, Taiwan's Justice Ministry warned about a fake government notice saying Taiwan was deporting protesters who had fled Hong Kong. EPA aims to reduce truck pollution and avert tougher state controls. The Trump administration on Monday took its first step toward tighter pollution controls on trucks, an anomalous move for a government known for weakening environmental policies, but one that would preempt tougher state rules. Rue Wheeler, the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, began the legal and regulatory process for curbing highway truck emissions of nitrogen dioxide, which had been leaked to asthma and lung disease. The EPA's current rule on nitrogen dioxide pollution from heavy-duty highway trucks, put in place in 2001, required trucks to cut emissions of nitrogen dioxide by 95% over 10 years. Carlos Ghosn's escape preparations spanned the globe. A team of operatives working to help Carlos Ghosn escape from Japan spent hundreds of thousands of dollars scoping out airports and other entry points in Indonesia, the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand before his flight last week, a person with knowledge of the matter said. Mr. Ghosn has a home in Beirut and faces no extradition to Japan. He is also a citizen of France, where he has spent most of his adult life. Mr. Ghosn, the former head of the Nissan-Renault-Mitsubishi alliance, is facing charges of financial misconduct in Japan and was free on bail. U.S. stocks shake off rising Middle East tension. Japan's Nikkei dropped 1.9%, as did India's key stock market benchmark, the Sensex. Markets at Frankfurt, London, and Paris were all down more than 0.5%. As far as the American stock market is concerned, observers suggest that investors have grown increasingly confident that the Fed's low-rate policies will help cushion the market from any jolts, as they did last year in the face of the ongoing trade conflict with China. How 7-Eleven struck back against an owner who took the day off. Mr. Matsumoto's fight with 7-Eleven made him famous in Japan, a country that has long struggled with a strenuous and sometimes deadly work culture. One of them, Hiroshi Nakayama, a 45-year-old electrical equipment wholesaler, had long watched the fight between Mr. Matsumoto and 7-Eleven and went to the store after his son's soccer game to check in. There must have been other solutions to fix the bad relationship with the company, said Mr. Nakayama, who turned up on Saturday after Mr. Matsumoto, running a skeleton staff, had closed for the night. Dairy giant Bolton files for bankruptcy protection. The company, which is based in Dallas and reported $1.18 billion in sales in 2018, has been trying to adjust to those unfavorable trends, but was hampered by debt, Bolton's chief executive, Tony Sarsam, said on Monday. Just 2 months ago, Dean Foods, the largest milk company in the United States and one of Bolton's biggest competitors, also said it was seeking bankruptcy protection. After making a number of acquisitions in the late 1980s, the company entered a turbulent period, resulting in its 1995 sale for $2 billion to the private equity giant KKR. Over the next decade, the company was slowly whittled down, with many of its divisions and brands sold off, Bolton said in the filing. 4 things to know about YouTube's new children privacy practices. YouTube said viewers who watched a video made for children on its platform would now be more likely to see recommendations for other children's videos. New requirement for YouTube producers in September. YouTube said it would require all video producers on its platform to designate their videos as made for children or not made for children. The platform's new limits on data mining send a signal to other popular sites offering children's content. They may also be subject to the federal children's online privacy law. American consumers, not China, are paying for Trump's tariffs. Mr. Trump has continued to incorrectly assess that China, not American companies and consumers, is paying the cost of the tariffs. Tariffs may have worked as a negotiation chip to get China to the table, but recent academic research shows that leverage has come at a steep price for some American businesses and consumers. Another study published in October by researchers at Harvard University, the University of Chicago, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston also found that almost all of the cost of the tariffs were being passed on from businesses in China to American importers. AI comes to the operating room. The new approach streamlines the standard practice of analyzing tissue samples while the patient is still on the operating table to help guide brain surgery and later treatment. The study involved brain tissue from 278 patients, analyzed while the surgery was still going on. The researchers used images from tissue from 415 brain surgery patients to train an artificial intelligence system to identify the 10 most common types of brain tumor. New owner is selected after $146 million nursing home collapse. After $146 million nursing home collapse. The Department of Housing and Urban Development recently reached an agreement with Greystone, a New York real estate finance firm, for the chain of Chicago area elder care facilities, according to documents obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. HUD solicited bids for the Rosewood facilities, a dozen nursing homes, and one assisted living center until the end of May, but since then it has repeatedly declined to disclose the names of the prospective buyer or the purchase price. HUD said in court documents that the owners had improperly diverted millions of dollars in federally insured funds to another nursing home that was not part of the program. What if a vaping tax encouraged cigarette smoking? What if a vaping tax actually encouraged cigarette smoking instead of reducing it? A new study suggests that these new taxes have the potential to do just that by discouraging adult smokers from considering nicotine vaping, a safer way to ingest nicotine, or encouraging vapers to switch to cigarettes instead. This study, published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, examined what happened in Minnesota, one of the first states to impose a steep vaping tax. A long-standing decline in adult smoking in the state slowed way down, while smoking in the states that hadn't imposed big vaping taxes continued to fall. The researchers concluded that making e-cigarettes more expensive discouraged Minnesotan smokers from trying them and caused fewer of them to switch away from smoking. And that has been Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 7th. Reading the Times for Tuesday, January 7th, 2020.